My area of focus is in energy projects with a particular focus on bioenergy and waste. At the minute, we're active in the waste sector across a variety of specialisms. We're doing anaerobic digestion, advanced thermal treatment, pure energy from waste, and municipal waste contracting. So that's a little bit more about what we do. There's a slide here which you can pick up on the pack afterwards, which tells you a little bit more about our waste and bioenergy expertise. Today we thought, as this is a great opportunity to speak on the UKTI stand, that we'd give you some themes in various areas which are going to be of interest to people who are coming into the UK. I'm going to look at the financing aspects. My colleague Carl Thompson, who specialises in engineering and construction contracts in the waste sector, will talk to that. And then finally, my colleague Matt Germain will talk about some of the subsidy regimes and the regulatory framework in the UK. So, as the slides say, I'm going to speak about funding and project structuring, and this is broadly what I'm going to cover. What type of projects can be financed in the UK? What needs to change to open up the financing market? And then coping with uncertainties to help with financing. So firstly, which types of project can be financed? First, a quick look at the current market in the UK. The market is, I still think, overall quite risk-averse when compared to other sectors. There's been more activity in the last 12 months, but other subsidised energy technologies such as solar and onshore wind remain easier to finance in the UK. But I do think that there is a perception that merchant energy from waste, advanced thermal treatment waste projects still carry a little bit too much risk for mainstream funders. That's not to say that debt isn't achievable, but it is still, when compared against other sectors, reasonably hard to get financed. So there's a balance to be struck, I think, between bringing waste projects to funders at the right stage and trying to make a bit of a new market in financing new technologies in the waste sector. So what are the options? Bank debt is obviously the most obvious option, and there are players in the market from Green Investment Bank, Foresight, Gravis, and many others. So if it's needed, you're going to need to make sure that you've got various things in place. The planning and consents, long-term fuel supply contracts, and a technology wrap across the EPC piece, which Carl's going to speak about a bit later on. You're also going to need a good covenant and the usual security package. There are, however, alternative forms of financing. You can look at grant funding to fund the shell and core works. You can do a deal with your EPC or your technology provider, often in exchange for shares in your business. And you can also look at expensive construction finance and then look to refinance once you're in steady state. But this latter form of alternative forms of financing is often hard to secure. So bank debt and equity remain the main focus. So what are the three things to consider, three key things to consider when scoping the project from a funder's perspective? Firstly, I think the thing that we're seeing is that smaller facilities, and by that I mean up to about 50 megawatts, that are modular and that can be rolled out quickly with minimal design change, are likely to satisfy your funder and its TA more easily. Secondly, have you done your homework in terms of the geographical capacity for the fuel which you're going to put into the plant? And have you considered the holy grail, which is the co-location with a power and or a heat off-taker? Funders do like to see that. And finally, I think you've got to engage with your financial, your technical and your legal advisors early in the process. Some advisory teams have moved from the PFI waste and waste to energy market into this new merchant world, and obviously our team is included in that. So what needs to change to open up the financing market? To help with the post-PFI merchant waste market and to help it take off and grow as it seems to be doing, I think the following market conditions need to arise. Firstly, a clear, stable and predictable incentive regime. Contracts for difference are not yet ticking that box in the UK, and Matt is going to touch on that a little bit more in his element. Funders and developers also need to try and avoid contractual overcomplication. And you could say that's rich coming from a lawyer, but it's true. PFI in the waste and waste-to-energy sector did develop a very robust and fundable suite of contractual documents. And we shouldn't be starting from scratch with any of these projects. There is a good bank of precedents that can be called on. Developers also have a responsibility in their own right to only bring projects to the funding community which are actually ready to be funded. And that's what, as I touched on earlier, they need to cover off some of the key issues, whether that's securing the site through option, whether it's planning, consents, environmental permits, nailing down the fuel supply and the offtake. It all needs to be thought through carefully before approaching funders and getting that traction with them. And finally, the final observation in terms of what sort of needs to change to improve the funding market, in my view, is RDF export, so the export of fuel into the continent, needs to be made less attractive. Tax changes on the continent in Germany and Holland are starting to make some difference there, but it's still early doors. But gate fees in the UK certainly need to start to fall to attract the investment in the UK. The next thing I want to talk about is coping with uncertainties to help secure financing. There are several uncertainties that developers need to address in developing waste infrastructure in the UK. The first one is planning. Funders don't usually engage until planning is in place and through the judicial review period. CFDs also require planning to be in place. So early engagement with your local planning authority and with the local community is going to be vital. And how can you do that? Well, you can actually pay the local planning authority or offer to pay their costs. That often helps to expedite the process. Secondly, arm's length contracts. Developer waste companies and technology providers will usually need to establish an SPV which sits at an arm's length from their main corporate body to receive the financing. And what they often don't understand, technology providers who are sort of sponsoring these projects, is that arm's length contracting means just that. You can't necessarily control the SPV into which the debt and the investment is made. And so educating certainly the smaller players in the market is a real challenge. The next observation is in respect of feedstock. Trying to pass the calorific value risk or the biomass content risk of the fuel onto the fuel supplier is pretty unpalatable. And so you need to consider how you can incentivize your fuel supplier to take some of that risk. One of the obvious ways to do that is to share some of the upside with them. And finally, I just wanted to mention PPAs. The PPA market in the UK is still quite restricted. It's quite a narrow market, especially for grid export PPAs. As I mentioned earlier, if you do your homework and you can find a good power off-taker co-locating with someone who needs power on a light industrial estate or something, then clearly that is going to be an attractive hedge for the grid export. So I hope that's been a useful high-level canter through some of the issues that the funding community in the UK is taking on board and looking at. I'm now going to hand over to Carl, who's going to look at construction, EPC and operational matters.
Right, by way of introduction, my name is Thompson. I'm a partner at Osborne, Clarke, and I specialise in construction and engineering. Most recently, over the last 7 years or so, been involved in drafting EPC contracts for a range of sectors, but a lot of EFW plants. What I want to discuss this afternoon is some of the top tier issues that funders look at when deciding whether or not to put any money into a project. I'm talking about debt and equity here. So if we go to the slide, first point there I've mentioned is technology risk and provider. It seems quite obvious, but especially for debt providers, they will want to see a technology provider who has got reference plants, preferably in the UK, but that's not necessarily a bar to them providing funds, but they do want to see a track record of commercially viable technology. Equity providers still like to see a track record, but they're prepared to take a little bit more risk than the debt providers. It's not just the technology either. They will be looking at the entity that has developed the technology, and I will be coming to this soon, but they will be looking at the financial covenant strength of the technology developer. Obviously, they're looking at, if things go wrong, have they got rights of recourse against this entity that has provided the technology? With EFW plants, there's a feeling that there's a lot, it's a very complex scheme and therefore requires a complex EPC contract. That's not actually right. The technology might be complex, but in terms of the legal contract that is required to deal with the engineering, the design, the procurement and the construction and the ongoing maintenance, it can be based on a standard form. What I see a lot of IChemE Red Book, which is perfect for EFW plants, but I'm also seeing a lot of the FIDIC form contracts, Silver Book and Yellow Book. They can very easily be adapted, and that's what us lawyers do with schedules of amendments to these contracts. But you don't have to spend thousands and thousands of pounds in legal fees going off to obtain a bespoke contract. The standard forms are a very good starting point, and the debt and equity market are more than comfortable with standard form contracts. What is key is single point responsibility. What will not fly, particularly with debt providers, is a multi-contract route where you've got one technology provider, one civils contractor, one electrical balance of plant, one mechanical balance of plant. It just won't work, especially when you're into the EFW sector. They want a wrap. So they'll want a significant EPC contractor with significant covenant strength who will wrap the technology as well as the civils, electricals, etc. They will, under this single point responsibility umbrella, also be looking at the EPC contractor to provide some O&M cover during that 12 months, 24 months after it's been completed. Now, there are some EPC contractors that just point blank refuse to do that, but you've then got interface issues with the O&M contractor. So as a starting point, a debt provider is going to say, I'd like the EPC contractor to give me a wrap, not only of the technology up to construction and commissioning, but also to wrap the operation and maintenance for a period thereafter, 1 year, 2 year, 5 years. The next bullet point, covenant strength and performance security, touched upon this ever so slightly, and this comes back to technology risk and single point responsibility. It may be that you've got a technology provider who has got kit that is proven to work, but it hasn't got the financial clout to underwrite a £60 million project. However, you may have an EPC contractor who has got that clout. So what the finance houses are looking for is an EPC contractor with the financial clout to wrap the technology risk. They will also be looking for, from that EPC contractor, parent company guarantee, a bond, performance bond, warranty bonds, advance payment bonds, and they may also look at retention. EPC contractors do not like retention, but the funders may look at retention. They also may look to tweak the milestone payments such that they're not significantly at risk at any one stage, just in case the EPC contractor goes under. But this takes up an awful lot of my time negotiating bonds, on-demand bonds, default bonds. Predominantly, I see on-demand bonds. They're coming back into the market. They went out of favour for some time, but the market seems to be requiring on-demand bonds, certainly during the construction phase. When you get into the warranty period, when you've done complete commissioning and you're into defects period, they will look for a warranty bond, which will be more akin to a default bond and will be for a far lesser sum than the main on-demand bond during the construction phase. In terms of price and time certainty, it seems to be stating the obvious, really, but in particular a debt provider, he wants to know if he's lending 40 million, 50 million, 60 million, that he's going to get the plant for that amount. In that context, his lawyers will be going through the EPC contract and seeking to limit the EPC contractor's ability to get time and money. That may be a problem for EPC contractors. They didn't choose the site, for example. So an EPC contractor may be saying, well, if to the extent I put my piling in and I discover something that was unforeseeable, I need extra time and I need extra money. But if I'm acting for a debt provider, I'll be saying, no, you take ground condition risk. You have to undertake ground investigation surveys at the outset. Likewise, with force majeure, contractors will like a very broad interpretation of force majeure, allowing them time and money. The debt providers, the equity providers will be saying no. So invariably, in an EPC contract, the only way an EPC contractor is going to get time and money is if it's a variation or a breach of contract by the employer. Then we look at guarantees. What I'm talking about here, I talk about availability and performance. What the employer and the financiers are looking for is a guarantee that after paying 60 million, the kit is going to work and it's going to be reliable. That is achieved by availability and performance guarantees set out in the EPC contract with liquidated damages attached to the two concepts to the extent the plant doesn't perform as it should do. Again, this is something that takes an awful lot of time to agree with the EPC contractors. It's actually more of a technical issue than legal, but what it all comes down to is what can the EPC contractor get from his supply chain? Because it's going to be a very foolish EPC contractor who guarantees something up the chain that he hasn't backed off down the chain with a technology provider, for example. But then again, the technology provider may not be able to stand behind the guarantees. So it becomes a little bit circular there, and we're looking back at the single point responsibility. The financiers are not going to say, well, we'll hold you to that performance guarantee, but only to the extent you can recover from your technology provider. They won't do that. The main EPC contractor will be expected to take the risk. The final point that we seem to spend an awful lot of time on is rejection rights and liquidated damages, and how they're calculated and what they might lead to if the cap on liquidated damages is met. First of all, looking at rejection rights, this is a really tricky subject. There are lots of lawyers out there and lots of employers that still feel that rejection rights should be in EPC contracts. So you could have the concept of an EPC contractor getting all the way to the testing phase. He's spent 60, 70 million of the contract price. He cannot get past the testing phase, and you've got a hair trigger rejection right. Rejection allows the employer to say, take everything away and give me all the money back. Now, I mentioned the standard form contracts previously. It's interesting that your standard FIDIC contracts, Silver Book and Yellow Book, they have the right to reject, whereas your IChemE Red Book, which is used for plants, the major EFW plants, doesn't have a right to reject. What the Red Book does, it says that if and to the extent the plant is bad and it falls outside the liquidated damages scheme, i.e. the employer has not been adequately compensated by the liquidated damages, then effectively the employer agrees a reduction in the contract price, but he still ends up with a plant, albeit performing at a lower level. Now that's a problem for financiers who've got a financial model based on the plant performing above a particular threshold. If it's below that threshold, the financial model falls away. So banks, equity players, and employers, their lawyers, usually do stick with a rejection right, but the EPC contractors are usually very, very careful to make sure that rejection right actually is never going to rise. The threshold is so low, and they've chosen a proven technology that it's not going to arise. We come on to liquidated damages. Again, more of a commercial issue than legal. It's a case of liquidated damages, in order to be enforceable in law, need to be a genuine pre-estimate of your loss. So the employer works out that if this plant performs at X% below what it should do, what are my losses? And he can include his financial losses there as well. So lost revenue, including finance costs. The contractor, there's always a bit of a horse trade with the contractor, what he can accept and what he can't accept. You usually end up with a figure, and it's usually reflected in the contract price. What an EPC contractor will then try and do is cap out. He'll try and say that I'll be in for X thousand pounds per week or per percentage point below, but I need to cap out at a certain level. That gives you the next problem. What do you then do if he does cap out? Do you then go back to rejection? Well, an EPC contractor is not going to accept that once he's got past takeover and commissioning. But it's a conundrum that you just need to make sure the cap is sufficiently high that the financiers are comfortable that it works through the model, it washes through the model. Last thing on liquidated damages that I want to discuss is EPC contractor will try to, when he's doing the horse trade with the employer, he'll be seeing what he can get from his supply chain. It's actually quite unfair if you think about it. An EPC contractor, if you look at risk and reward, he gets an awful lot more money than a technology provider. But if he's got liquidated damages at the tune of £50,000 a week or £100,000 per percentage point below the guaranteed performance, and he'll try and pass that down to the technology provider. Technology provider's just going to say no, or he's going to cap out under 1 day's delay or 1 percentage point below. So I think where I'm going with that is that an EPC contractor that goes to a financier saying, I can't step this down, doesn't really get anywhere with the financiers. The financiers say, well, that's your risk. We need the RAP, we need the single point responsibility, and we're financing with you as EPC contractor because you've got the financial covenant strength to cover those losses. The fact that you haven't been able to pass them down is your risk, and it's part of being an EPC contractor. So I hope that's been quite useful in terms of the I think 7 points that I waste a lot of time on. On that, I'm now going to hand you over to Matthew.
Okay, the last slot we're going to cover is just looking at some of the subsidies and regulatory framework which people should be aware of looking at inward investment into the UK waste market. The first point I put up there was sort of waste regulation, how is the UK doing? I mean, I think from my view, and the verdict I think probably shared by a lot of people in the industry, is it's doing quite well. What we've always got to remember with the waste industry, that it's a highly regulated industry, given the nature of what effectively it's dealing with. But for the UK, I think there is certainly a good level of structure and cohesion and certainty around the regulatory framework. And there's certainly a lot of certainty around the aims and objectives of the regulatory framework. And they are really the protection of the environment and human health, conserving raw materials, and strengthening the economic value of waste. And all of the regulatory framework is underpinning those notions. What we have in the UK, good examples, we have the landfill tax escalator, which has been highly successful. Had the consolidation of environmental permitting, again, which has been highly successful, very welcomed. It makes permitting sites, particularly when you've got an aggregated portfolio of different waste sites, much more simple because you're dealing with a single point of regime. We've got a kind of joined up planning process with PPS 10. And we even now have a code of practice for MRF. So, they are good examples of where the waste industry have got things right. All of that, in my view, effectively gives the UK a very attractive inward investment market. I think operators and investors understand the regulation. They can make sensible investment decisions based on the regulation. And the regulation does what all regulations should do, which creates a level playing field. So everyone coming into the market is regulated in the same way and understands what they can and can't do. The other thing to be very aware of with UK waste regulation, getting a bit legal, is that it's largely derived from European law. So most of the UK regulatory framework comes from the European Union. So if you think about the Waste Framework Directive, the list of wastes, waste shipment regulations, directives on landfill packaging, waste electricals, all of that is European law, which is then transposed down into the UK. The Waste Framework Directive is a really good example of how things are working. It defines waste to an extent. It clarifies key concepts like reuse and recovery, enshrines the hierarchy, and it's also good at some of the key target setting which is needed in terms of member states needing to produce waste prevention plans and waste prevention objectives. It also has introduced some key elements like separate collection for 2015 for glass, metals, plastic and paper. So, in general, looking at the UK market, it's not a bad picture. How the UK has taken that on in terms of what it's need to do itself. 2011, we had the DEFRA Waste Policy Review. And then in December 2013, we had the waste management plans, which were done for England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, etc. And as also, we've had PPS 10 on the planning side and local authority waste management plans. So the combination of those things is actually quite positive. Just looking at the waste management plan for England, for example, that covers all the key concepts you need to know. It covers hazardous waste, municipal waste, C&D waste, industrial. It incorporates some of the key other plans, like the AD strategy plan and the shipment of waste plan. And again, it's driving that whole concept of moving the member state economies towards a zero waste economy. So as I said, there is a good level of regulatory certainty. Looking at energy from waste, coming on to the third point, there's probably a slightly different picture. It's probably picking up some of the themes that the other guys have mentioned. There are more regulatory challenges in that side of the industry. I think with general waste infrastructure, non-energy infrastructure, the regulatory position is much clearer. But with energy, it's more challenging for the reasons the other guys have mentioned, but significantly because the energy from waste market, like all renewable markets and technologies, is driven and underpinned by subsidy regimes. There are very familiar regulatory challenges, but I think the industry's got used to those. And the key ones you'd say were planning and environmental permitting. Most players in the energy from waste market understand that, know how to do it. They have teams of professional advisors who can help them achieve that. There's obviously planning risk in all sorts of projects, but there is certainty on what's required. New regulatory challenges, and this is, as James mentioned, I just really wanted to focus on one, and that's the contracts for difference, which is a new kid on the block in terms of the subsidy regime and is coming right upon us. What that is, if you are not familiar with it, it's a key part of the government's electricity market reform policy. And contracts for difference are set to replace the current main subsidy regime for renewable electricity, which is a renewables obligation from the end of March 2017. It is a 15-year government-backed contract, so a contract between the renewables or the generator and the government effectively. And effectively what happens is that the generator is paid a top-up payment between the market reference price for electricity and a contractually linked, CPI-linked strike price. Those strike prices a generator has to bid into to secure through set allocation rounds, which I'll come back to. It's not a power purchase agreement, that's something different. The power purchase agreement is what the generator has to secure the revenue from the actual electricity it's selling. There is also an eligibility window which precedes the actual allocation round. So at the moment, for this year, the first eligibility period to bid into is, I can't remember the dates exactly, but it's most of October this year, following then the application period. The key thing to be aware of is that you will have in that certain technologies bidding against other technologies. So for example, advanced thermal treatment will be bidding for CFDs against offshore wind. So you can automatically see some of the tensions within that. Are CFDs a good or a bad thing? I think in our experience, and certainly the players we're talking to in the market, is that they're largely positive. However, they are new, and with anything new there comes risk and uncertainty. But let's try and sort of look at some of the pros and cons, and in an unbiased way. I mean, looking at the pros, what a CFD does give you, it gives you a standardization of contract, which is good. Everything previously would have all been bundled up in the power purchase agreement. Different electricity suppliers have very different power purchase agreements. The CFD contract will be largely non-negotiable. So everyone is going to be contracting basically on the same terms. It's a CPI-linked price, which the renewables obligation was not. It certainly removes some of the wholesale price exposure and takes away some of the volatility which was in the renewables obligation certificate market. And crucially, without getting too much into the renewables obligation market, there was something called a recycling payment, which was often a delayed payment. That no longer exists or won't exist when CFDs come through. There should be faster settlement, and it should, and this is crucial for funders, give them a virtual floor price in terms of certainty of a revenue stream. The other thing is you don't need to find a market for your ROCs, which you used to have to do if you're a generator, because your ROCs would be bundled up within your PPA. So looking at the cons, I think the key thing to say, and this is what's coming through very strongly, is you might not get one. And this is something that generators are finding quite difficult to grapple with, as is everybody. There is a constrained allocation pot of funds, and therefore not everyone who bids for a CFD is going to get one. And also there is a specific allocation round. So we've got November this year, 2014. That's the only allocation round that's been announced. We're expecting it to be same time, 2015 and so on. But there's obviously uncertainty around that. Previously, there was no time period where you could go and effectively obtain your ROCs. There's also the point of, as I said before, that you are going to be competing against other technologies. There's going to be this constrained pot. And I think there's also a bit of a misconception in that, as I said before, the top-up, in terms of the payment, is a top-up from the market reference price for the power, not from the price in your PPA. So the key thing from any financial model is what you can achieve in your PPA. If you can get that as close or certainly pegged to the market reference price, you've got the most chance of receiving your full strike price, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of concern that the smaller players in the market who may not be able to attract the best PPA terms may not be able to get higher up the market reference price curve, and therefore they'll have a gap in their revenue between what they're topped up to. There's also the risk of generators having to pay something back. If the grid market reference price starts to exceed the strike price, the generator will obviously have to pay that back. So, in anything you can list pros and cons, and obviously have done. However, I said at the start, I think certainly what we're seeing, and I think this is the important thing for anyone looking at the UK waste market, energy from waste market from an inward investment point of view, is certainly within the UK itself and the funding community in the UK itself, contracts for difference are being seen as a good thing, and there's a high level of confidence, which is important. However, the uncertainty about whether you will achieve one and the allocation rounds is the main issue, and I think that's the main thing to take away. We would hope, as the allocation rounds go through in years to come, that risk will start to fall away as people will start to understand that, yeah, you're effectively going to get what you bid for. So that is really the end of things. I mean, in terms of, obviously, I've covered quite a lot there, and there's obviously quite a lot of law, which is never a good thing. And, there are other regulatory challenges, but, CFDs seem to be certainly the one to focus on. In summary, I think, just to reiterate what I said at the start, I think from an inward investment point of view, the regulatory picture in the UK for waste is good, it's strong, it's predictable, it's cohesive, it knows what it's doing, the regulators know what they're doing, even the enforcers kind of know what they're doing sometimes. So, that's a good picture. Energy from waste, more challenges, but, it's a market which is maturing month by month, and hopefully with things like CFDs bedding down, it will become a little bit more predictable. That's the end of our talk. I would just like to say a huge thanks to UKTI and to Victoria for inviting us. It's been a pleasure to be here and to give this talk. Myself, James and Carl, and there's a few other members of our team dotted around, We'll be around for the next sort of 15 minutes or so if anyone would like to ask questions. Is there time to answer questions from the top? Okay. Well, I think the message is that we're going to can it. So if you want to ask any questions, please just give us a shout at the end. Thank you very much.